Welcome to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Today, we're going to be focusing on planning for capacity building and development activities.
Yeah, that's really important. You can have all the good intentions in the world, but without a plan, a solid plan, your capacity building efforts are probably going to be much less effective.
I've definitely seen that happen in the field. So why is planning so crucial in this line of work? What makes it so important?
Well, planning is essential because it helps to create a roadmap. It guides everyone involved toward a shared objective. Planning also ensures that there's a common understanding, of the goals, the strategies, the roles of all the individuals. And this all leads to more sustainable results.
So you're saying a well-defined plan helps to avoid confusion and wasted effort. Everyone knows what they're working toward and how their own individual contributions fit into the bigger picture.
Exactly. Yeah, and when we're talking about planning for capacity building and development, there are a few specific tools and frameworks that have been shown to be really effective.
Yeah.
One of these is the logical framework approach. It's often called the log frame.
Log frame, yeah. I've heard that term before, but maybe you could just refresh my memory on what it is and how it's used.
Sure. The log frame is a structured methodology that helps us think through the entire process. So how are we going to achieve our objectives? It's presented visually, usually as a matrix. This matrix breaks down a project into its key components.
So it's a way to see all the different parts of a project and how they relate to each other.
Yes, exactly. The log frame, it makes us start by considering the big goal, the ultimate impact we want to have, and then we work our way down, outlining the outcomes that have to be in place for that goal, the outputs that are going to contribute to those outcomes, and then finally all the specific activities that are required to produce those outputs.
So you start at the top and work down. Makes sense? That way all the activities are aligned with the overarching goals.
You got it. The log frame helps us to stay focused on what's important and to make sure that our efforts are strategic and purposeful. It's all about making the most of the resources that we have and increasing the chances of getting the impact we want.
It seems like this could also be a helpful tool for monitoring and evaluating progress, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. By defining clear indicators and means of verification for every level of the log frame, from activities to outcomes, you can track progress, measure effectiveness, and make any adjustments that you need to along the way.
So the log frame isn't just for planning. It provides a framework for monitoring and evaluating progress, too. It's making sure we're accountable and effective.
Okay, we've talked about the roadmap, but what about the resources? The resources needed to make all of this happen. How does planning connect to budgeting for these activities? Right, that's where results-based budgeting comes in, or RBB as it's usually called. RBB is a budgeting method, and it actually has a really strong connection to the log frame. They're both very results-oriented. In RBB, budgets are directly tied to the expected results of the project.
So instead of just giving money based on activities, RBB focuses on outcomes. It links the budget directly to achieving those outcomes.
Precisely. With RBB, every dollar spent is contributing to achieving the goals that have been set out in the log frame.
This is all making sense now. We have a clear roadmap with the log frame and a budgeting approach that aligns with it through RBB.
Yeah.
But what about understanding how change actually happens? I mean, how do we know that the activities that we plan will actually lead to the changes we're looking for?
That is a really important question. It brings us to the idea of the theory of change. A theory of change goes beyond just listing activities. It helps us understand why we think a change is going to happen.
So we're looking at those unspoken assumptions about how our activities are going to lead to changes.
Yeah, exactly. It's asking, if we do X, then Y will happen because. By really spelling out these pathways, these causal pathways, we can make our planning stronger and increase the likelihood of having a real impact.
That's a really important point, especially when we're working in complex environments with so many factors in play. We need to be able to identify the key levers for change and then develop very specific interventions.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The theory of change is not just some abstract idea. It's a tool, a practical tool that we can use to make our planning more robust and ultimately more successful.
So we've discussed a planning framework like the log frame, a budgeting approach like RBB, and the theory of change for understanding how change works. Clearly, effective planning requires us to think carefully about all of these. But what about the specific tools that are used on the ground to actually put these plans into action? What do capacity building and development advisors actually use to make these changes happen?
That's a great question. And it's a perfect transition to our next topic. We're going to be exploring the key tools that are commonly used by capacity building and development advisors, often called CBD advisors, We'll talk about their strengths, their challenges, and why it's so important to use them properly and ethically. But we'll dive into all of that in part 2 of our discussion. Welcome back to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Before we jump into those tools used by capacity building and development advisors, I just want to quickly add one more thought about the theory of change. It's such a powerful tool to make our planning more robust, evidence-based, and in the end, more successful.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just about, listing activities, but understanding how change actually happens, those mechanisms that are driving it. So let's get into the practical stuff. What are some of those tools that capacity building and development advisors, or CBD advisors as we call them, actually use? What do they use to facilitate change on the ground?
Well, there are several key tools that CBD advisors use a lot. These include things like census and vetting, training, monitoring, mentoring and advising, and policy development. Each of these tools serves a different purpose, and they each have their own strengths and challenges.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. First, could you explain what the purpose of census and vetting is?
Sure. Census and vetting are absolutely crucial to establish a really strong foundation for any capacity building initiative. They help us define and identify, the personnel within a law enforcement agency. And this ensures that individuals who don't meet the standards, standards of conduct or competence are excluded.
So it's about making sure the law enforcement agency is professional and has integrity, right? By carefully screening its personnel. This seems especially important in places where there might be concerns about past misconduct or corruption.
Precisely. Census and vetting are meant to prevent people who have been involved in misconduct from being part of the reform process. It involves a thorough verification process. We want to make sure that individuals meet all the necessary criteria, including respect for human rights and following ethical standards.
It sounds like a really complex and sensitive process. What are some of the things that need to happen for a census and vetting program to be successful?
You're right, these programs can be challenging to implement. Success really depends on a number of things, strong political will, a clear legal framework, robust due process mechanisms, and a commitment to upholding individual rights. And it also requires sufficient resources and the expertise to carry out the vetting properly.
It's clear that census and vetting are really important in setting the stage for successful capacity building. Now let's move on to another key tool, training. What role does training play in these efforts?
Training is essential for bridging the gap between what someone already knows, their existing skills, and what they need to know for their role within the law enforcement agency. It's all about making their knowledge, their skills, and their abilities better so they can do their jobs effectively and professionally.
So it's about giving people the tools they need to carry out their responsibilities, making sure that aligns with international standards or best practices.
Exactly. But it's also important to remember that training can't solve every problem. It can't fix underlying issues with education or recruitment. Training works best when it's specifically designed for the people who are going to receive it and delivered in a way that helps them to learn and remember the information.
All right, that makes sense. It's about figuring out what specific training people need and then designing and delivering those programs in an engaging and effective way. So we've talked about building a solid foundation with census and vetting and improving skills and knowledge through training. But what about giving ongoing support and guidance to individuals and institutions as they work through this reform process? Where do monitoring, mentoring, and advising fit in?
Monitoring, mentoring, and advising, which are often called MMA, offer a really complementary set of tools to support local reform processes. Monitoring allows CBD advisors to track progress, identify challenges, and give feedback when it's needed.
So monitoring is basically keeping a close eye on how things are going and identifying any roadblocks or areas where more support is needed.
Yes, exactly. It's like a continuous feedback loop, It helps us to adjust things and make sure that the project stays on track. Mentoring and advising are more personalized forms of support. Mentoring focuses on individual development, providing guidance, encouragement, and support to people as they navigate their roles and responsibilities. And advising offers more technical and strategic guidance, helping institutions to develop and implement, effective policies and procedures.
It sounds like M&A requires a mix of both technical expertise and also really strong interpersonal skills. CBD advisors have to be able to build trust, communicate well, and give constructive feedback.
You are absolutely correct. MMA is all about building relationships and working together with local partners. You need cultural sensitivity, empathy, and a really good understanding of what's happening in the local context. Now, in addition to census and vetting, training and MMA, there's also policy development.
That's a good point. What's the role of policy development in all of this?
Well, policy development is crucial for providing a clear and consistent framework for reform. Policies that are sound, they set standards, they define roles and responsibilities, and they offer guidance for decision-making. They're really essential for setting up a professional and accountable law enforcement agency.
So you're saying policy development is like setting the rules of the game. It makes sure that everyone understands what they're supposed to do and how they should operate within the system.
That's a great way to put it. Policy development basically creates the blueprint for reform. It outlines what we want to achieve and sets up the mechanisms to get there. It's critical for making change stick and making sure those reforms last over time.
These tools, census and vetting, training, MMA, and policy development, they offer a comprehensive approach to capacity building and development. They address all these different aspects of reform, from making sure the personnel have integrity, to building skills and knowledge, providing ongoing support, and setting up a clear policy framework.
Exactly. All of these tools are interconnected and they reinforce each other. When they're used effectively and together, they can really boost the effectiveness and sustainability of those CBD efforts. But it's important to remember that these tools aren't set in stone or one size fits all. They need to be adapted, taking into account the specific challenges and opportunities in each situation.
That makes sense. There's no magic formula. We need to be flexible and creative in our approach, using all the tools we have to adjust our interventions to the specific needs of our partners.
And we should never forget that effective capacity building isn't just about technical expertise. It's also about building relationships, fostering trust and working together with our partners towards shared goals.
Absolutely. Our success ultimately depends on the strength of our partnerships and our ability to give local actors the power to drive the reform process. But we shouldn't forget about the importance of incentives and risk management in all of this.
That's an excellent point. And in part 3 of our discussion, we're going to dive into those crucial aspects. We'll explore how we can encourage progress and deal with the inherent risks that come with capacity building and development initiatives.
Welcome back to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. In this last part, we're going to be talking about 2 really important things for success in this field: incentives and risk management.
Yeah, that's right. If we want a capacity building and development work to be effective and make a lasting impact, we have to think about these elements. So let's start with incentives. They're crucial for motivating progress and making sure our local partners feel like they own the process.
I'm interested to hear more about that. How do incentives actually work when we're talking about capacity building? Can you give me some examples?
Sure. One approach that's been proven effective is using quick impact projects. These are smaller projects, relatively low cost, and designed to show results quickly.
Could you explain a little more about how they actually help with capacity building?
Absolutely. QIPs are all about addressing those immediate needs that the community has identified, and they're implemented with a lot of involvement from local people, which really helps to build trust and confidence in the whole capacity building process.
So QIPs are a way to give something tangible back to the community while also encouraging them to take ownership and feel empowered.
Exactly. When we show that we're committed to addressing the priorities of the local community and we empower them to participate in their own development, those efforts become much more sustainable.
That's a great point. But how do we fund these QIPs? Where does the money come from?
Trust funds can be a really valuable source of funding for QIPs and for other CBD activities too. These funds are specifically set up to support things like the rule of law, human rights, or development goals.
So we can use these trust funds to get the resources we need to implement projects that are impactful, projects that benefit the community and the capacity building process at the same time.
Precisely. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that with any capacity building and development work, there are going to be risks. If we want to reduce the impact of these challenges, we have to be proactive about risk management.
That's so important. Can you tell me more about what risk management looks like when we're talking about capacity building and development?
Risk management is really a systematic process. It involves identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and mitigating potential risks that could slow down progress or affect the overall impact of our projects.
So it's about looking ahead and trying to figure out what obstacles we might encounter, then coming up with ways to deal with them before they become big problems.
Exactly. The first step is identifying those potential risks. These could include things like political instability, security issues, logistical challenges, or even gaps in the capacity of our partner institutions.
Okay, so once we've identified those potential risks,
What do we do next?
Well, then we analyze each risk to see how likely it is to happen and how big of an impact it could have. That helps us figure out which risks are the most important to address and where to focus our resources.
So we're going to put most of our effort into dealing with the risks that are most likely to occur and that could potentially cause the most damage to our work.
That's right. After analyzing and prioritizing the risks, we need to come up with mitigation strategies. These strategies could include things like contingency planning, making sure we have diverse resources, or adjusting project timelines and activities.
So flexibility is key. The situation can change, and we need to be ready to adapt our strategies.
You've got it. We need to continuously monitor and review the risks throughout the whole process. We have to stay alert, reevaluate those risks regularly, and make adjustments to our strategies as needed.
This conversation has really highlighted the importance of planning in advance and thinking carefully about incentives and risks in capacity building and development work.
Yes, absolutely. When we have a well-structured plan and a clear understanding of how to use incentives and manage risks, our chances of achieving meaningful and sustainable results go way up.
That's a great takeaway. It's not just about the technical stuff. We also need to foster ownership, navigate those challenges, and create an environment where positive change can flourish.
That's it, exactly. When we embrace these principles, we can help build stronger institutions that are more resilient, more effective, and better able to serve their communities.
This has been a really informative episode of the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basic principles of planning to the tools, the incentives, and the risk management strategies that are so critical for success in this field.
We hope this conversation has given you some valuable insights to take with you and apply to your own work in international policing and capacity building.
Thank you for listening. We're looking forward to continuing this conversation with you in future episodes. Until then,